Okay, guys. Good morning, everybody. Pleasure to have you here. We have a fantastic group of speakers, myself not included. So some of you might be wondering, why is it that we're holding a mini summit on health in the business school? And the answer is very simple, because interdisciplinarity is really where all of the important problems in science are solved. The mapping of the human genome happened because a bunch of people who have completely different skill sets got together. If only one group of people were trying to crack that particular mystery, then we wouldn't have gotten anywhere. If you're trying to address how to get people to be healthy, and you want to promote messages to them so that they can consume those messages and act on those messages, then having someone like myself, a psychologist and a behavioral scientist, would make sense. And then, of course, all of the medical issues would be addressed by some of our speakers. Here are two speakers, Dr. Sagner and Dr. Lustig. So one of the things that I always tell my students is, yes, of course, you have to publish in our specialized field, but also think broadly. Don't restrict yourself to only publishing the 2 or 3 or 4 journals that people expect you to publish. There's a bigger world out there. There are a lot of intellectual landscapes to visit. Visit them all. It's boring to always go back to the same tourist destination. Visit many places. So with that, I just want to give you a sense of what our program is today, and it could change. It's not set in stone. I'll just give down the opening remarks, and then my talk will be titled "Using Evolutionary Psychology to Design Effective Health Promotion Messages." For those of you who don't know anything about evolutionary psychology, you'll get a bit of a primer. Then Rob Lustig, I love the title, the 4 Ds: Darwin, Diet, Disease, and Dollars, How the Sugar and Processed Foods Changed Society. Having the 4 Ds reminds me when I was an MBA student, I was taking a management course where it was always the 6 C's and the 4 L's and the 7 D's. And being a smart ass, I put up my hand to the professor and I said, so is it basically that in management, all of the forces revolve around identifying a bunch of things that start with the same letter? He wasn't very pleased with it. I don't think I got a good participation grade that semester. Then we'll wrap it up in terms of the talks with Dr. Sagner, who is coming all the way from Europe for this. The history of wellness, from marketing snake oil to modern preventive medicine. And I don't want you to presume that all folks who do marketing are scammers and they're trying to push things on us. Marketing can be used for good, and of course it can be used to spread idiocy and quackery. Then perhaps we'll have a short panel discussion, and then maybe some questions from the audience, and then some closing remarks. So I'll start off with my lecture. The only reason I chose to go first, I thought maybe because I'm going to give a bit of a lecture on evolutionary psychology, it made sense that I'd be the first guy to speak. So as I said, this is the title of my talk. This is being funded by my chaired professorship. We have here a university-wide chaired professorship program. I hold a mouthful of a chair, the Concordia University Research Chair in Evolutionary Behavioral Sciences and Darwinian Consumption. Darwinian consumption basically means applying evolutionary theory and biology to study our consuming instinct. That's basically what it means. So I'll start off with sometimes these personal anecdotes are quite telling about what we're talking about. Many years ago, I had a student, as part of their group project in my undergraduate course in consumer behavior. They wanted to study why is it that people do bad things to themselves. I mean, why is it that they smoke heavily? Why is it that they overeat? And so he told me of a personal story. He's a heavy smoker, and he said that when he orders a pack of cigarettes at the convenience store, if the first pack that comes to him has a warning label that is relevant to him, then he'll return it to the clerk until he gets a warning label that could not be relevant to him. So this will cause harm to your baby if you're pregnant. Oh, well, I'm a man, it doesn't apply to me. So even though it was an incredibly ridiculous strategy, right, and ridiculous denialism, yet somehow that attenuated, that assuaged his sense of guilt at doing this. So it really is a challenging problem to get people to change their behaviors. We have all sorts of defense mechanisms to stop us from doing the right thing. Next, what I'd like to talk about is two broad, erroneous views of human nature that actually result in many suboptimal intervention strategies. The first one is the idea that the mind is tabula rasa. We start off with an empty mind without any biological imperatives, and it's only socialization that teaches us who we end up becoming. And so how does this apply in the context of what we're talking about today? Well, why do people stray from their marriages? Oh, it must be pornography that's to blame, right? Why is it that people desire fatty foods? Advertising is to blame. Why do women constitute the overwhelming sufferers of anorexia nervosa? Well, it's due to the thin ideal that is promulgated in the media. Why are some young men prone to violent and reckless behavior? It's due to violent video games. Because, of course, there is no historical record of men being violent to one another prior to the advent of the video games. All men walked around in unison singing John Lennon songs until video games came along. Why do some teenagers engage in an overactive sex life? Well, of course, it's because of the over-sexualized song lyrics, right? Well, these types of views result in facile intervention strategies. Oh, the answer is very easy. All you need to do is legislate the content of all of these products, and voila, the problem will go away. And of course, that's not how it happens. The second erroneous premise, if you'd like, is that people make poor choices because of lack of relevant or complete information. So why is it that people eat unhealthily? It's because they're not aware of the inherent dangers of it. Teach them and they will improve. Why is it that people lead sedentary lifestyles? Well, they didn't know that not exercising for 40 years would result in negative consequences. Why do people smoke? Again, they don't know the issue. Why do people suntan excessively? Well, they didn't know that it causes melanoma. Now, of course, there's an endless number of ways that we could falsify this, but let me look at the last one. Women are much more aware, are much more knowledgeable about the ill effects of sun exposure as compared to men, yet they engage in suntanning much more. So if it were only a question of lacking knowledge, then we shouldn't expect that sex effect, but we do. So it's certainly a lot more than simply educating them. I'm not implying that sometimes educating them is not a valuable strategy, but it's certainly not the only reason that people do the wrong things. I'm very, very acutely aware that being overweight is not a good thing. As someone who was a very competitive athlete who had 4% body fat, now having 30% body fat is not a good thing. So I'm aware of that, but it doesn't mean that it's easy to change some of the trajectories that I've gone through. So now a very short primer on evolutionary psychology. One of the fundamental epistemological values of evolutionary theory is that it breaks up scientific explanations into two types, into what are called proximate explanations and ultimate explanations. Proximate explanations is where much of science operates. It explains the how and the what. How does diabetes operate? That's a proximate question. Most Nobel Prizes are won at the proximate level. There's nothing wrong with that. The ultimate explanation of the phenomenon is the Darwinian why. Why does the phenomenon, why does the behavior, why does the morphological trait exist in its form? From an adaptive perspective, from an evolutionary perspective. So typically when you're studying something involving biological agents, you want to tackle the problem at both the proximate and ultimate level. It's not that one is superior to the other. By tackling the problem at both levels, you really nail the explanation. And let me give you a specific example from the medical context, since this is ultimately a health promotion summit. So if you look at pregnancy sickness, it's something that recurs universally to many women across cultures and so on, across time. Well, a proximate question might be, how do the shifting hormones of a woman affect the severity of her symptoms, of her pregnancy sickness symptoms? That's a how question. The ultimate question would be, why have women evolved that particular physiological response? Why are they attracted to certain foods during that period of their gestation? Why are they repulsed from other foods? And the answer is a very simple and beautiful one. It's because Pregnancy sickness happens during a period in the first trimester called organogenesis, when the organs are forming in utero. It is uniquely important at that stage that the mother not be exposed to certain pathogens, certain teratogens, certain food pathogens that might wreak havoc to that developmental process. And therefore, the set of symptoms, the set of physiological responses, the set of things that the woman is attracted to or repulsed by are really an adaptive solution to that problem. Now you might say, okay, that's great, it's a nice scientific explanation, but who cares practically, from a practical perspective? Well, it turns out that the more pregnancy sickness you experience, the less likely you are to have a miscarriage. The more likely it is that you'll have a good sort of trajectory in terms of your gestation, because it serves a defense mechanism. When you go to see your OBGYN, what does he or she typically do to attenuate their symptoms? They try to shut off that particular set of symptoms. Right? It's very similar to how in the sort of the classic example of evolutionary medicine is those people who don't take any medicine when they have a cold end up typically recovering more quickly. Right? You want to soften the symptoms of a cold, the chill, the fever, the eye, the tearing, the sneezing, the coughing. But all of those mechanisms ultimately are there to expel the viral load. And so by you taking a drug, you're actually making it longer for you to recover. For those of you who are interested in evolutionary medicine, the guys who really developed the field are Randy Nesse and George Williams. Check out their book called Why We Get Sick. It looks at health from an evolutionary perspective. And here we have two physicians who I'm sure will tell you, maybe we'll discuss it during the panel conversation. Most physicians, when they're trained in medical school, will certainly go through their degrees without ever exploring some of these evolutionary ideas. To continue with evolutionary theory, if you look at these 6 maladaptive behaviors, if we are adaptive creatures, why is it that we engage in behaviors that have really negative consequences downstream? So the first row, you have pathological pornography, pornographic addiction, then pathological gambling, then excessive financial and physical risk-taking, and then the bottom row, compulsive buying, eating disorders, and excessive sun tanning. And the first thing you'll see epidemiologically, if you're quick enough and astute enough, is that the top row, it's almost always men who are afflicted by these disorders. And the bottom row, it's always women who are afflicted. There is no culture that's ever been uncovered where that finding is not of that form. And it's not close. It's not 52 to 48. It's typically in the 9-to-1 ratio. And by the way, when we say, for example, compulsive buying, we don't mean you have 5 pairs of shoes. Don't worry, that doesn't mean you're a compulsive shopper. It's a psychiatric, it's a diagnostic. It has to be a dysfunction for it to be classified as a psychiatric disorder. Well, typically, if you look at social science explanations for some of these phenomena, they're perfectly incorrect. So let me give you one example. Anorexia nervosa. Let's look at what the evolutionary explanation is versus the standard social science explanation. So the socialization perspective is anorexia nervosa exists because of the incessant exposure to the thin ideal that women are exposed to in media, right? And therefore, find a way to stop these images and anorexia nervosa will cease to exist. Well, it's not that simple. As I describe in one of my books, out of 100 women who are exposed to the exact same images, roughly 97 to 99% of those will not experience anorexia nervosa. In other words, if this is the causal factor, it is not explaining 99% of anorexia. So not really a very strong, powerful causal agent. And Hippocrates, sort of like the father of modern medicine going back several thousand years in ancient Greece, documented the exact same epidemiology several thousand years ago. So if it's due to media images, then you have to explain how the media images were found back then. What is the evolutionary explanation for anorexia? It's actually an incredibly brilliant explanation. It was the genesis of the idea comes from Wasser and Barash. Barash is a sociobiologist at University of Washington, there is a model called the reproductive suppression model, which explains a reality that many female mammals will experience if they're facing a harsh environment. So imagine you are a cow, and what is one of the environmental threats that you're likely to face? Well, any animal is lack of caloric availability of calories. Let's say there's not enough grazing on it. Well, if a cow is already pregnant and she receives the environmental input that the environment is poor, then she will have a miscarriage. If she's not yet pregnant, she won't go into her estrus. In other words, her reproductive potential is shut off as a function of the environmental harshness that she faces. And that mechanism has been found across many mammalian species. Now, how does that relate to anorexia? Well, one of the first things that happens with anorexia is what's called amenorrhea, right? So the shutting off of the menses. Primary amenorrhea would be when you've yet to have your menses, and now you don't go into it. Most women have secondary amenorrhea. They already had their menses. They're now 20, and now they become anorexic, and now it shuts off. So then the question becomes, if anorexia, if you like, is the human form of the reproductive suppression model, well, what is it that women are viewing as an environmental threat in their environments? The cow, it's the lack of pasture to graze on. Well, in the human context, the top two are poor mate support and poor kin support. In other words, if women, rightly or wrongly, it doesn't matter if she's objectively accurate or not, if she perceives that she is likely to receive poor mate and or kin support, then she shuts off subconsciously her reproductive potential through disordered eating. So that already introduces a lot more complexity to the story than simply saying, manage the images that women are exposed to in Hollywood, and voila, anorexia will cease to exist. It's more complicated than that. So let me next describe some health messages that are very much rooted in evolutionary psychology. So if you think of sexual dysfunction in men, impotence, it increases with age. You're much more likely to be sexually impotent or impotent at 70 than you are at 20. The one group of young male who suffer from impotence are, anybody want to guess what they do as a behavior?
Pornography?
No. I won't look at the physicians.
Video games?
No, heavy smokers. They're very, very heavy smokers. So now, before I put the next image, which actually comes from a public health message, the typical approach is educate through epidemiological data. Here is the likelihood of you having lung cancer when you're 74. Here is the likelihood of you developing heart disease when you're 81. When I'm 21, I'm immortal. None of this matters to me. This is all BS. This only applies to some old guy. It doesn't apply to me. But watch the next. What do you think would be a good way to grab the attention of a 21-year-old without needing to be much of an evolutionary psychologist? What do you think? Sex. There it is. Low rise may be the end of your genes. I mean, it doesn't get more Darwinian than that, right? If you can't, excuse the colloquialism, get it up, you're done. You're cooked. That gets my attention when I'm 21. If I can't perform tonight with the gorgeous girl that I've been trying to hit on for the past 2 months, giving me epidemiological data about lung cancer is completely irrelevant. Let's do a few more. When it comes to sun tanning, women do it a lot more. By the way, single, young women do it a lot more. And they discount the future consequences for the immediate benefits. Who cares if I get melanoma maybe when I'm 73? I'm going to a party tonight, and Tony's going to be there, and I'm going to have a healthy glow. That's much more important to me. So how should you target them? Well, again, use a set of cues that, evolutionarily speaking, make sense to them. And this is exactly what this app does. This is an app out of Australia called CUV. It basically shows you, you take your photo, your selfie, and it shows you what happens to your skin ravage that happens to your skin as a function of how much you're exposed to UV exposure, right? So hitting me with an aesthetic cue is going to matter a lot more than telling me about odds ratios of getting melanoma when I'm 74. And the exact same idea when it comes to alcohol in this case. It's the same idea. At least when you're targeting women here, you're using an aesthetic-based message to say, this is the ravage you'll experience. I mean, yes, liver cirrhosis is bad, but I don't care about that. It doesn't apply to me. But this really gets my attention if I care about my sense of aesthetics. Now, one of the things that in the past 20 plus years, as I've developed the field of evolutionary consumption, I've always noticed that academics, at least social scientists, my natural scientist colleagues, all listen to my stuff and say, of course we're biological beings. The social scientists are the ones who huff and puff and say, what the hell are you talking about? How does biology matter in business school, sociology, and even in psychology? The ones who never huff and puff are practitioners. So when I give a talk in front of executives, I almost never get any obstacles or blowback. Why? Because they're not vested in a competing paradigm, right? They don't care. All they care about is, does it work or not, right? So if I'm giving them a set of tools to better understand consumers or employees or their spouses or whatever it is, they just go, yeah, sure, that makes sense. So let me just tell you two quotes here. One from actually the year of my birth, and another one from one of the founders of one of the biggest advertising firms. Because effective advertising is an appeal to human fundamental needs, desires, and motivations. It is an appeal to basic human nature. People the world over have the same basic need for food, clothing, and shelter, the same ambitions, the same egotism, and the same temptations. The setting changes, the climate, the culture, the idiom, but the basic human nature is the same everywhere. Now you might think, geez, isn't that obvious? It's not obvious in the social sciences. To even say that there is such a thing as a biological-based human nature is heretical. And believe me, I've lived this for the past 20 plus years in academia. It is insight into human nature that is the key to the communicative skill. You want to communicate properly, you need to understand the biological roots of what tickles our fancy. I'm almost done. This is an exchange I took from the Charlie Rose show, sort of a highbrow show late at night on PBS. Unfortunately, Charlie Rose has been swept by the tsunami of the Me Too movement, so we no longer have Charlie Rose show. But when we did have the Charlie Rose show, he would bring in extraordinary guests. So this is the actual transcript, or an excerpt from a transcript, where he had E.O. Wilson and James Watson on. E.O. Wilson is one of the greatest scientists. He's still alive. He's an evolutionary biologist and entomologist at Harvard. And James Watson is the co-discoverer of the double helix structure of DNA. He won the Nobel Prize with Crick. And so let me just read for you their exchange, because it exactly describes what I've been doing the past 20 years. It describes what this summit is about. So psychologists, most of the practicing psychologists and theoretical psychologists and the vast majority of social sciences who really determine a lot of the intellect that goes into our policies, and our philosophies, our political philosophies, have no connection at all to their true nature of humanity or what human nature is at a biological level. This is still a huge gap, and I believe that we will start to fill that in a way that will be useful in years immediately ahead. And then James Watson retorts, I see the coming. The past century was the coming together of chemistry and biology. This century will be the coming together of psychology and biology. And then Charlie Rose adds, why? And so to end it, Dobzhansky, a very famous evolutionary biologist, this has now become sort of a standard truism, famously stated, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And I propose to slightly tweak it. Nothing in the marketing of health promotion makes sense except in the light of evolution. Thank you very much. And next we have